the election of 2016, many of us, women and men alike, have been wondering how we can make a difference in the midst of so much chaotic change and political dysfunction. Sometimes, hearing stories of those who came before us in the fight for social justice can inspire and empower us. So today I'm going to tell you the story of two sisters from the 1800s who were also living during a very divisive time. Sarah and Angelina Grimke were born into a slave-owning family, a very prominent family, in Charleston, South Carolina. Yet they went on to become the strongest voices for the abolition of slavery and for women's rights before the Civil War. They were called traitors, liars, and even worse, for defending those whom society had deemed less than. Yet time and again, they stood up for what was right, and they wouldn't back down. In other words, they were what we would today call badass women. They were fierce and unapologetic. They had integrity and courage. They believed that everyone deserved freedom, justice, and equality. Now, inevitably, after a talk like this, someone will come up to me and say, "What about the men? Why didn't you mention the Southern men in the 1800s who were fighting for abolition and women's rights?" Well, I don't mention them because they didn't exist. I hope that everyone here today, no matter your gender, can be inspired by Sarah and Angelina's example of how to be social justice badasses. Sarah was born in 1792 and Angelina in 1805. Their father was a wealthy slave owner and judge. The family owned dozens of slaves who worked in the Grimke family home and in their plantation outside of Charleston. Sarah was the older of the two sisters, and when she was just 4 years old, she saw a slave being whipped. As the story goes, she immediately walked outside of her house into the streets of Charleston and down to the docks. She wanted to board a ship and go somewhere where slavery didn't exist. Even as a young girl, Sarah's moral compass told her that slavery was wrong. Later on in her life, she did go somewhere where there was no slavery. She moved to Philadelphia when she was in her 20s to join the Quaker Church and to practice her anti-slavery values. Inspired by her sister, several years later, Angelina followed her. After the sisters moved to Philadelphia, they began publishing articles in an anti-slavery newspaper and speaking at anti-slavery gatherings for women. Soon, the men in the abolitionist movement insisted upon attending the lectures as well, but that gave the sisters a bad reputation in print and among the public for giving talks in front of men, which was scandalous at the time. Their church even sanctioned them for defying the traditional role of women. So Sarah and Angelina began publishing articles and giving speeches on the rights of women, whom they now saw as enslaved by the patriarchal laws and culture of the United States. Now, what's remarkable about Sarah and Angelina is that they didn't convince themselves to ignore injustice, even when it was the status quo, even when everyone around them said that slavery and racism were normal. And the next point I bring up because I think all of us do this. Instead of questioning their own values and judgment in the face of injustice, they instead questioned the values of an unjust society, and they decided to change it. They would spend the rest of their lives fighting to end slavery and promoting equal rights for women. Now, my story isn't as dramatic as Sarah and Angelina's, but I was born to fight for women's rights. I grew up in a small town in Montana in a conservative family and church. And I think that's why Sarah and Angelina's story appeals to me so much. I shouldn't have turned out a feminist, but somehow I did. Even as a young girl, I experienced and I witnessed sexism in my church, in my community, in my school. And I didn't have the language to name it, but I could feel it, and it bothered me. Today, I do have the language to call out sexism, misogyny, and patriarchal BS. And I can see how it intersects with other types of injustice, such as racism, anti-LGBTQ prejudice, and poverty. When I stand up for women's rights, I'm fighting these other injustices as well. After the election of 2016, I attended the Women's March in Austin, Texas. And when I came back to my community, I became very active in organizing women's issues right here. I started contacting my politicians, I wrote letters to the editor, and I even published opinion articles. This past summer, I really stepped outside of my box, and I attended an immigration rally at the federal courthouse in Brownsville, Texas. I went to the border to bear witness to the injustice of family separation and deportation that was taking place here in the United States, here in Texas. As I was standing in front of the federal courthouse in Brownsville, I thought of Sarah and Angelina and their fight for freedom, justice, and equality for everyone. And I wondered if I was doing enough to be a badass woman in the spirit of Sarah and Angelina. Because even though they lived to see the end of slavery, we still live with the racism and prejudice that upheld it. They didn't live to see women's suffrage, but they did inspire later suffragists such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But even today, when badass women stand up to the patriarchal status quo, women like Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, these women, like Sarah and Angelina, are still called traitors, liars, and even worse. Now, you would think that we would have advanced from the early 1800s when Sarah and Angelina were first fighting for women's rights, and in many ways we have. But badass women today, we still look around and we see all types of injustice and inequality in our democracy. Sarah and Angelina knew that the women of their day struggled with this as well. How to use your voice, how to stand up, how to worry about being criticized. So in 1838, Angelina developed a practical strategy for activism. She wrote a pamphlet and she gave women 4 steps that they could take to bring about an end to slavery. These were practical things that women could do in their everyday lives, things that they could do in their homes and in their communities. She told women that they could end slavery if they would read, pray, speak, and act. Her advice still stands today when many of us feel unsure and don't know how to use our voices. First, read. Educate yourself on the issue. You can't change the current if you don't know the history, nuances, and various perspectives on the problem. Now, I took this to the extreme. I went to graduate school and got a PhD in women's literature and feminist theory. But now I know the issues inside and out, and I can stand my ground. And even more importantly, I can make informed decisions. And there are still women's and social justice issues that I still don't know about, so this reading will never end. Then pray. I feel weird telling people to pray, but keep in mind that Sarah and Angelina were badass women, but they were also very, very devout Christians, and so were the people who were listening to them. But today we can have an expansive view of religion and of prayer, and we know that prayer can take many forms. We can meditate, we can reflect, we can ponder, journal, laugh, cry, sing, however we express it. Connect your hopes and fears to the issue, to the bigger picture. When I pray for the strength to see the good in the world and in people in spite of its injustices. I've been praying a lot this week. This meditation and this reflection sustain me, and they ensure that my values come from a place of integrity and authenticity. Then speak. Speak out by fostering dialogue. within your community and among your friends and your family. Be the voice of knowledge and inspiration in your sphere of influence. Now, I know that here in the South, sometimes we are afraid to speak out and express our opinions on the issues that matter because we don't want to disrespect or offend people. But let me tell you, it is not disrespectful to have an opinion that is different from the status quo. It is not offensive to have an opinion that differs from your friends or from your family. I should know. After a lifetime of speaking out, I can tell you that, yeah, sometimes people don't like it and they don't like me. But the people who do matter to me respect me, even if they disagree with me. And finally, act. This action can take many forms: voting, volunteering, protesting, organizing, writing, giving speeches, showing up. I've had the opportunity to do any number of these things over the past few months, but it's only because I had the basis of reading, praying, and speaking, of integrating all of these steps, that I could take action with courage and with confidence. Now, what strikes me about Sarah and Angelina's advice is that it meets each of us where we are at. These are things that are part of our everyday lives, things that we can do in our homes and in our communities. Each person gets to decide which step is right for them right now. So if you are wondering how you can be effective and empowered in the face of social injustice and political injustice, consider this earlier example of Sarah and Angelina Grimke, badass women from the 1800s. Now, I want everyone here today, women, men, no matter your gender, just think about the social justice issue that is so important to you. It could be immigration, racial prejudice, a woman's right to choose, trans rights, voter suppression, gun control, environmental justice, whatever it is, think of Angelina's 4 steps. Read, pray, speak, and act. We are all at different places in our journey to becoming badass women and activists. Where are you? What is the next step? Commit right now to taking that next step. Because if all of us would read, pray, speak, and act together, we can change the current. Thank you.